It didn't happen that often. So Grace married George Metalius. They left Manchester and moved to Gilmanton, in which she was supposed to be raising her 3 kids, except she wanted desperately to be a writer. So she wrote in her spare time. I'm not being mean when I say any of this. Ignoring her children so she could write with a typewriter on her lap. She finished a manuscript, and back then, I'm looking around, some of you know what a transom is, right? The window over the door, and in all the office buildings in New York, the publishing houses, if you didn't have an agent to get your book published, you would literally throw your book over the transom. So when the publisher walked in the morning, the manuscript would be lying on the floor. Well, that's what Grace did, and she was rejected by as many as 20 publishers for this book she called Peyton Place. And it was only until a woman named Kitty Messner, small publishing house, picked it up and read it. She and her husband were partners. She went to her husband and said, I want to publish this book, but we have to do it on one condition. And he said, what's that? She said, don't read it. So Mr. Messner loved his wife, so he agreed to it, and this small publishing house published Peyton Place, and it was an instant sensation. Way before the internet, way before television marketing and advertising campaigns, in a very short time, Peyton Place became the best-selling first novel in publishing history, which was phenomenal for an unknown first novel author, a woman from a small town in New Hampshire. Why did it become such a sensation? Grace was a really good interviewee, if you will. So when the book was coming out and all the scandalous stuff was being thrown about, you all know the premise of the book. It's a true story that occurred in New Hampshire. A young woman who had been continually molested by her father throughout her childhood ultimately took his life and went on trial for murder. And now, that was a less enlightened age, if you will, so it was a very scandalous trial. And that is at the root of Peyton Place. So that scandal spread, and Grace would give interviews, and one writer even said to her, you know, your husband will probably lose his job because of this, won't he? And she said, yeah, he will. And the next day he did. He was an English teacher and baseball coach at Gilmanton High School who was fired because of the salacious nature of Grace's book. That just fueled book sales. And that publisher of that newspaper we just mentioned, when he found out about the book, he encouraged every reader of his newspaper to not read Peyton Place, which I think you all know triggered exactly the opposite response, and that everybody had to have a copy of Peyton Place. It's funny, everybody I've asked, they all have a copy, and there are certain pages turned down so you can get to them right away, but nobody's ever read it. I don't know how that happened. So the sensation just kept going on, and Grace did what the publisher asked because the publisher was making money. So she had to go out and promote the book, and that made her very uncomfortable. She was very plain in her appearance. She was very self-conscious about that, and she had to get dressed up and go to New York, to go to these publishing parties and go on TV, live TV, to be interviewed about the book. So on one occasion, and I've watched the kinescope of this, she's being interviewed by a guy who may or may not make it in television. His name is Mike Wallace. And Mike Wallace was trying to make a name for himself back in the early 1950s, 56, 57. And so he's going to interview Grace Metalius live in New York about the book. And you watch it, and Grace is very uncomfortable. She's got a dress on that looks like it was made out of cardboard, and she's smoking, and so is he. Black and white, so the whole thing is fogged in smoke. And she had come to know the questions that she would be asked, and there were certain ones that set her off. And so the first question he asked her is whether the book was autobiographical. And by its nature, that's rather an offensive question. And she looked him in the eye and said, no, Myron, it's not. Mike Wallace's real name is Myron Wolochensky. He's a Jewish kid from Brookline, Massachusetts, but he wants to be Mike Wallace, the all-American boy. So Grace knocked him right back into his seat. So the interview goes on, and eventually it got around to Grace's social life because she and George had separated. After he had lost his job, she was drinking a lot, she was seeing other men, not looking after her kids. And so Mike Wallace asked about the state of her marriage. Did the book contribute to the dissolution of your marriage? And she said, I don't know, Myron, why don't you tell us about your 3 marriages? Because he'd already gone through 3 wives by 28. And the interview went downhill from there. So Grace toughed it out, and she gave as good as she got. But what you saw in that interview was indicative of what was happening in her life. She really was spiraling out of control. Kitty got her to write a sequel, and many people claim that Kitty wrote it, called Return to Peyton Place. But think about what she was trying to duplicate. Peyton Place, again, best-selling first novel of its time, became a major motion picture, the biggest stars of the day. Lana Turner, Lloyd Nolan, Lauren Green, and the movie was a sensational hit. So the pressure was on to do a sequel. So she did a sequel called Return to Peyton Place, which also became a really big motion picture. And again, her writing was failing. She wasn't doing it. She got a boost of money when Peyton Place became the first primetime soap opera in television history. I'm looking around the room, some of you remember. It was so popular, it was on 2 nights. It was on Tuesday and Thursday night. Now, you need to know that my father was a classmate of Grace's for 8 years at the Ash Street School, and then 4 years at Central High School. And even as a kid, I knew I wanted to be a writer. So I saw a window. I convinced my father that because I wanted to be a writer, and he went to school with Grace Metalius, who wrote Peyton Place, I should be allowed to stay up late and watch Peyton Place. He didn't know I was in love with Mia Farrow, and that's why I wanted to stay up and watch the show, which is true. So Grace's career is stalled out. They keep pushing her. She writes 2 more books. One was called Tight White Collar, very reflective of her Catholic upbringing in a mill town like Manchester. And the other was called No Adam in Eden. Again, very rich with religious symbolism. And then at 39, Grace died of alcohol-related illness. She drank herself to death in short terms. So you would think the story ends there, tragically, but in fact, in recent years, there was a book published called Inside Peyton Place, and essentially the author, Emily Toth, has re-examined Grace Metalius' work and writes about her as being the first author of feminist literature in America. So Grace's legacy is entirely reviewed now, and the book Inside Peyton Place was recently, the movie rights were recently purchased by Sandra Bullock. Sandra Bullock wants to play Grace Metalius. I have seen pictures of Grace Metalius, and I've seen pictures of Sandra Bullock. But this is good news for some people, because now if they ever do a movie about me, I'm George Clooney. Why not? There's no holds barred here. So let's do that. But it is true that, again, she's being re-embraced as a serious writer, and I'm happy to report that in Manchester, just last year, we got a road sign erected, Grace Metalius Way, off Bridge and Union Street. So next time you're driving on Bridge Street, keep an eye out for that.
Hopefully they'll stay up.
So far, so good.
Daniel Webster.
Daniel Webster, yeah, again, a political figure of great renown throughout the United States, who was born in Salisbury, New Hampshire. Unfortunately, his boyhood home has fallen into great disrepair, and the state, go figure, doesn't have money to bring it back to what it should be, so there's a private drive underway now to restore his childhood home to its former splendor. Interesting guy. He was a senator, but not from New Hampshire. He lived in New Hampshire, but back in his day, senators were appointed by governors. And the governor of Massachusetts appointed Daniel Webster to be a senator from Massachusetts. But we forgive him. Because he did important things for New Hampshire. He served as Secretary of State. He ran for president twice. But the thing that endeared him most to people from New Hampshire was when he used his lawyering skills in an important case, Dartmouth versus the state of New Hampshire. The University of New Hampshire was getting underway as a land-grant university, and they couldn't help but look at this school over in Hanover called Dartmouth College and the good things they were doing over there. So the University of New Hampshire made a unilateral grab to take over Dartmouth College. And it was not a pleasant time. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And Daniel Webster, a very proud graduate of Dartmouth College, represented the college at the Supreme Court. And in his closing arguments, he uttered a statement that any Dartmouth graduate will know by heart. He said, it's a small college, but there are those of us who love it. And he prevailed, and Dartmouth College remains the independent institution it is today because of one of its graduates, Daniel Webster. So,
I'm not sure the first name, but is it Frank Tupper?
Earl Tupper.
Earl Tupper.
Yes, Tupperware. Anybody have Tupperware at home? It was created by a gentleman from Berlin, New Hampshire, Earl Tupper. Yep, and I call him the Earl of Berlin. He was a young kid, very energetic and enterprising growing up in Berlin. He would take eggs from his family farm and put them in his wagon very carefully so they wouldn't be broken, and literally go door to door and sell eggs. And perhaps some germ of an idea was formed at that time, because eventually he earned a PhD in chemical engineering, and he was working with the petroleum industry, and they were trying to figure out what to do with some of the waste products that came from the production of gasoline and oil. It was this ugly black gooey material called slag. And Earl Tupper looked at that, and only he saw something beautiful. So he took this plastic product and he refined it further and ultimately came up with these beautiful, clear, sealable cases that he started marketing as Tupperware. He did have an ego. That's why his name is in the name, Tupperware. And he did it through an unusual fashion, which is something that most housewives in America back in the 50s knew. Tupperware parties, home parties, for all the beauty, and it was recognized in the Museum of Modern Art for its aesthetic beauty. People didn't buy it when they saw it in the stores. So a young woman named Brownie Wise came to him and said, let me develop a marketing plan by which typical housewives will hold Tupperware parties and sell the products in their home. And that marketing technique was the genius behind Tupperware. He was not unlike Ray Kroc. He was really smart, but he was a real crank. So Brownie became the personality of the company, and he resented that because Life magazine would do a story about Tupperware, and it was all about Brownie Wise in Florida doing these parties. So he and Brownie had a parting of the ways, but you can't argue with the success of the product, which is still there today. And you know, when you put your leftovers in there, you had to let that little bit of air out. Yes, well, he felt that burping was very not genteel. So Tupperware tried to market it as the Tupperware whisper. we burped in my parents' house, so that's how it went. So yes, Tupperware, Earl Tupperware.
How about Dean Kamen?
Yeah, Dean Kamen. It's hard to realize, but the Millyard of Manchester right now, that 1 mile, had more patents last year than Silicon Valley.
Really?
And Dean Kamen's Deca Corporation is one reason for that. You know, the silly thing is he's probably best known around the world for the invention of the Segway. And we all know that in the end, that's really been a frivolous machine that can't make money. They're being made in China now, and they just can't sell them, so they don't expect to produce them much longer. But you know, when he was a student at Worcester Polytech, he dropped out of school after he invented a dialysis infusion unit that fit in the size of a briefcase. Now, I've worked at hospitals, and it used to be you would come in for your dialysis, you'd sit in a lazy-boy recliner with a machine the size of 3 refrigerators next to you to clean your blood. Well, imagine the freedom he gave to so many people by inventing something that fit in something as small as a briefcase. And that was just the beginning. He was recently cited by USA Today in a video for making improvements to the robotic wheelchair that he invented some years ago, which enables people who are confined to the wheelchair to climb stairs, to rise up and look you in the eye when they shake your hand, incredible movement, and now the prosthetic limbs that his people are creating for the GIs coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan are staggering in what they can do. They can tell the difference when they pick up a dime and they pick up a grape. And it's intuitive, and his people are doing that. But the thing he's doing now may be his greatest legacy to science and to the world. He's creating a water purification device called the Slingshot. And if you have the time, go online, go to Google, look at Netflix and Google Slingshot and Dean Kamen. These machines, which now are knocked down to about $3,000 per unit, he wants to get it below $1,000. And to make this happen, he said he made a deal with the devil. Coca-Cola has the single best distribution system for liquids and other materials in the world. So he went to Coca-Cola and proposed to them, if you'll distribute my Slingshot machines, I will look at all of your vending operations and my team will renovate them and reinvent them. So if you haven't been to Burger King or McDonald's lately, when you go in now, you get your own soda. And you walk to a machine with a colorful array of buttons in which you can get a Dr. Pepper, Diet Dr. Pepper, Vanilla Dr. Pepper Diet, and that is from Dean's people. They reinvented the Coca-Cola distribution machines. And in return, Coca-Cola has agreed to distribute his machines. They can take the most foul liquid you can imagine, and they pour it in, and it comes out as potable water. Now, in the third world nations where people can spend their entire day walking for 2 hours to a well to get water and then walking back with it, this will revolutionize their lives and also their health, because most disease in the third world is caused by impotable water that makes people sick, whether it's dysentery or any other gastrointestinal disease. So he is very proud of this, and he's not a guy who looks back at what he's done. He's always looking forward. But I know that this, it's like kids. If you have more than one, you're not supposed to have a favorite. This is one of his favorites. So, all the best to him in carrying that forward.
Grenier Field.
Grenier Field, yes. Manchester-Boston Regional Airport.
Oh,
I know, thank you. It's important not just to people from Manchester, but from Americans all over, because Manchester Airport, Grenier Field, is where Alan Shepard learned how to fly. Alan Shepard was a kid growing up in Derry who had a bicycle, and he was fascinated by flight. So he would ride his bike from his home in Derry to the Manchester Airfield, which at the time was run by a gentleman named Carl Park. Carl Park had a grassy airstrip, but he had a tower built next to it, and Carl would sleep in the tower. And if anybody wanted to come land in Manchester, if it was after dark, they just buzzed the tower, and he'd go out and he'd turn on the lights, and you could land. And Alan Shepard was fascinated with this. So he wanted to learn how to fly, and he didn't have a dime to his name. So we asked Mr. Park if he helped out around the hangars, would he give him flying lessons? And he did. Free flying lessons. Alan Shepard went on to the United States Naval Academy. He became a fighter pilot. He flew in Korea. And when the war was winding down, late 50s, all of a sudden he heard about this new program, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. They were going to put men into space. And he thought, I want a piece of that. So Alan Shepard became one of the first Mercury 7 astronauts. And when it came time for the first American to go into space, they tapped Alan Shepard. And it was incredibly important to America. We were trailing the Russians in the space race. They had already launched the first satellite called Sputnik, and they launched the first man in space, a cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin. It's 1961. This is the height of the Cold War, and all of America was looking to NASA to do something to get us back in the game. So Alan Shepard was chosen to do the first flight. It was going to be a 15-minute suborbital flight. He was not going to go around the world. He was going to go up and he was going to come down. So the space capsule was built for that in mind. So on that day, in April of 1961, Alan Shepard is sitting in the capsule. I was a student at Gosford Park School, and we all were told, pick up your chairs, go down to the cafeteria. So 8 grades, pick up your chairs and go down to the cafeteria, in which there was a 13-inch black and white TV on the stage. I could have seen Cape Canaveral better than I could have seen that television. But we all did what we were told, and we were excited because we knew what was happening, and then we were told to take our chairs and go back to our classroom, which we did 3 times. They kept having delays because they weren't sure about the technology. And Alan Shepard is sitting up there this whole time, and apparently that morning he had a lot of the beverage the astronauts used to drink. Tang, yes, right. I just want to make sure you're listening. He had a lot of Tang. And after all these delays, it's almost 3 hours now, he's sitting there and he's getting very uncomfortable. And with another delay, he radios down and said, I've got to use the head. That's what they call the bathroom in the Navy. And they kind of went, now we can't. By the time we take you out of the capsule, again, 15 minutes, they didn't put a restroom in the capsule. So they said, no, you're gonna have to tough it out. We'll be going soon. And that was the wrong thing to say. Because he finally got to the point where he said, look, I gotta go. And the best scientists in the world are looking at one another. What'll happen? We don't know what to do here. So Werner von Braun, who knows? Somebody finally said, tell him to go. So he did. And 15 minutes later, when he splashed down, he really splashed down. But in that 15-minute suborbital flight, in spite of his bathroom incidents, he gave America faith again. All of a sudden, we were back in the space race. And that gave John Kennedy the courage to pledge that we would reach the moon before the end of the decade. And we did in July of 1969. Alan Shepard would love to have been on that first flight, but after his first voyage into space, he developed an inner ear infection, which affected his balance and simply was unable to fly. He chose to stay with NASA. He worked with mission control, and eventually, after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, he said, I don't care if I'm deaf for the rest of my life, I'm getting this operated on. So we had surgery to correct that inner ear imbalance, and in fact, it worked. So Alan Shepard was on Apollo 14. Think about that. You've all seen the movie Apollo 13, and you know the near disaster that we were able to avoid because of Jim Lovell and his crew, and yet Alan Shepard had the courage to step forward and say, I'm commanding the next one, and he did. So Alan Shepard from Derry, New Hampshire is one of a dozen men to walk on the surface of the moon, and he's the only man ever to hit a golf ball on the surface of the moon. He loved playing golf, so he smuggled 2 golf balls aboard the lunar excursion module in his spacesuit. That pocket was held closed with a New Hampshire product no one's mentioned yet. Velcro. The world headquarters of Velcro are in Manchester, New Hampshire. And he had a collapsible golf club that he took and he unfolded, and he dropped the 2 balls on the surface of the moon and he hit them. And kids love that, because they believe that in the lighter gravity of the moon, the balls are still going. I don't know if they are. Alan Shepard was a big hitter, but I don't know if he was that big. But what matters is his story goes on. It still resonates with people, especially people in New Hampshire. So, yeah, Alan Shepard's in it.
Was Tom Thumb or Nuts Pond or what's that?
You're right around it. You're circling right there. Tom Thumb was a famous midget, General Tom Thumb, who was in P.T. Barnum's circus and was considered the phenomenon of the world. until P.T. Barnum saw a midget from Manchester, a dwarf, named George Washington Morrison Nutt. His family owned the land around Nutt's Pond, and because and he was actually 2 inches shorter than Tom Thumb, and a much more versatile entertainer. He could sing and dance, so P.T. Barnum hired him, signed him to a $30,000 contract. This is in 1860, and he was paid more than the president at the time. And he performed for President Abraham Lincoln, he performed for Queen Elizabeth, but because Commodore Nutt, because General Tom Thumb had an army rank, P.T. Barnum thought it would be cute to give him a naval rank, so he became Commodore Nutt. And yes, he was a Manchester guy. He's on our Manchester Wall of Fame in the museum, and his body lies in Merrill's graveyard, which is a very small graveyard right next to the entrance of the Mall of New Hampshire on South Willow Street, kind of close to where the L.L. Bean factory is now, or outlet. And I'm not kidding, the headstone is about that big, and all it says is Nutt. Fitting headstone for a man of that stature.
How about Sarah Josepha Hale?
Yeah, Sarah Josepha Hale is a woman from Newport who was very influential as a magazine publisher. That was her claim to fame, and that's what got her in touch with the seat of power. Among other things, she wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. Nobody ever sang that when you were a kid? Or you don't sing it to your grandkids now? And she also was good friends with Abraham Lincoln. And as a woman of great faith, Sarah Josepha Hale helped persuade Abraham Lincoln that we needed a national holiday of Thanksgiving.
What Mother's Day? Was Mother's Day?
No, Thanksgiving is, she celebrated women in that way in the magazine, but her greatest claim to fame is that she persuaded Lincoln to observe Thanksgiving. So we do that to this day. And think about it, she wrote, Mary Had a Little Lamb. That's probably why we don't have lamb on Thanksgiving. Is that?
Revlon?
Yeah, Revlon. Revlon Cosmetics was founded by 3 brothers from New Hampshire, Manchester, named Joseph, Charles, and Martin Revson. Their name was Revson, and part of the reason they were lost to this community for a long time is because their corporate name was Revlon, and people couldn't associate, the 3 Jewish kids from the west side of Manchester, Revson and Revlon. What happened is they went into business with a $300 investment in a nail polish company in New Jersey, and their partner was a guy named Lackman. And they thought, like many other companies, let's combine our names to get a corporate name so we'll both be represented. And if you're selling makeup to women and your company name is Revlac, it sounds like you're selling paint thinner. It wasn't really going to go over. So they settled for the softer Revlon, and that really caught on. But it was a very cutthroat business in that time. There were a lot of other companies, Estee Lauder, I'm not a makeup person, Helena Bishop. So they were struggling to find market share with those other companies. But again, their company was coming into power in the early 1950s when television came around, this newfangled invention. And they found that when Helena Rubinstein advertised on a program called This Is Your Life, they were getting crushed. Because, think about it, there were 2 networks back then, CBS and NBC. So if you had a hit show, there were only 2 channels. So you would get the largest share of the audience, and therefore your ads would reach the largest part of the population. So they were getting killed, and they went to Martin Revson, the youngest brother, who was the marketing guy, and said, we got to come up with something here. We need to compete with this company. What can we do? And television was the answer, but the oldest brother, Charles Revson, who was a graduate of Manchester High School, I'm just throwing this to Don, West High School didn't exist until 1923. So Manchester High School is where Charles and Joseph graduated. Well, Martin, the youngest brother, West High School had opened, so he graduated from West. So they went to him and said, what are we going to do? And he said to his brother, we need to go on television. His older brother always resisted TV. Why? It was black and white. They were selling cosmetics, purple lipstick, red nails, and they would advertise in magazines, which had color. They didn't advertise in newspapers because they felt that if you were only reading newspapers, you couldn't afford their products. If you could buy a magazine for 10 cents, then you had some discretionary income. So that was his target, but mostly it was because of the color. But Martin finally convinced them they had to get into the TV game. And so they became the sponsors of a show called the $64,000 Question. The first game show in television history. And the premise was very simple. If you're a gambler or if you're not, it's double or nothing. If you can answer a trivia question, you win $400. If you answer the next one, you double your money to $800 and so on until you get to $64,000. It became an overnight sensation on television. People could not get enough of it. And ultimately, it created some real celebrities who took part in the contest. One of them was Dr. Joyce Brothers. She was an expert in prize fighting. They could not stump her. They wanted her off the show. They couldn't get her off the show. They very carefully measured audience ratings, and if you've not seen the movie Quiz Show by Robert Redford about the game show scandals of the 1950s, I do recommend it. It's very well done. And so the Revson brothers, in that period, the first year of the show, 33 million. Next year, 58 million. Next year, $85 million of the cosmetics market was theirs. And from that point forward, they were never challenged as the ultimate leaders in the sales of cosmetics. So the three brothers, did well for themselves. Martin is still alive. He's 102 years old. I wrote a column about the family, 20 years ago, and I called him and spoke with him. And I said, I'll send you a copy. And he told me all these stories, and he was great. And so I sent him a copy of the column after it was published. And I don't know why, for some reason, my first book had come out. So I sent him a copy of my first book. At the time, I'm thinking he's 82, and maybe the will's not done. So I sent him a copy of the book. And sure enough, about a week later, I hear back from him, and he's very gracious. Thank you, John, for the column. So many people get it wrong. You got it right. And I love the way you talked about, how we came about our decisions. And I love the book. My wife loved the book. He was married to his third wife. He'd outlived his first two wives. And so his third wife, he was 82, she was 55, had never been to Manchester. And she was very intrigued about the portrait I painted of his hometown in that book. And so here's Martin Revson. Would you mind if we come up Memorial Day weekend? Would you go out to dinner with us? Absolutely. I'm thinking that will thing is still got a shot. So he did come up with his wife, and we had dinner at the time at the Wayfarer in Bedford, which is no longer there. And we just hit it off. I mean, he loves wine, he loves movies, I do too. My wife sells wine. So we had a great time, and we said our goodbyes. They were going to the seacoast, and the next day, on the Saturday, I'm out mowing the lawn, and my wife comes out and says, John, Martin's on the phone. He wants to go out to dinner again tonight. So I may be the heir to the Revlons. But we've stayed close. I've not heard from him lately. I know he's not doing well now, but as recently as the 2008 primary, I was on C-SPAN hosting a pancake flipping contest with 8 Republican candidates and live TV. And I get back to the paper on my phone, and it's Martin. Hey, what are you doing up there with those idiots flipping pancakes on the stage? Funny guy. And again, it's a great inspirational story for kids who, there are no limits. Coming from New Hampshire carries no limitations. And we're seeing that play out now with the success of Adam Sandler, with the success of Seth Meyers, with the success of Sarah Silverman, Dean Kamen. I mean, these people are, making their mark in any industry you can name. And it's just great to be able to say that, I'm from New Hampshire, and we do amazing things when you come from this place. We'll do one more.
Ralph Baer.
Ralph Baer. Does anybody have kids or grandkids who play video games on the TV? You're all lying if you're not raising your hand. I know you do. The inventor of the original home video game was a gentleman who lived in Manchester for 60 years. His name was Ralph Baer. Ralph was an engineer working at Sanders Associates, having come to the United States to escape Nazi Germany. Got a job in military intelligence with the U.S. military as an interpreter, and eventually landed at Sanders Associates in Nashua, where he was working to develop simulators that pilots could use to train, that police officers could use for simulated drills. And what he came up with was this machine where you could use it, plug it into your television, and play games. And so he and one of his working partners, a gentleman named Paul Harrington, in 1969, played a game on TV, and they filmed it, and they have it. Ralph got the patent for the first home video game. The replica machine is called the Brown Box. That's what they called it. And he is in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He won the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his work with the military and with technology. And nobody knows this little unassuming guy, unless you read my column, in which case you know about him, because I wrote about it many times, and he's in my most recent book. So Ralph Baer is a giant in technology. I mean, he's like Mr. Spock, when they have the Star Trek adventure. If you watch him, it's like Elvis just came in the building. Sadly, Ralph passed away about a year and a half ago, but his son is working to preserve his legacy in Manchester, so he's gathering a lot of his material to bring to the Milliard Museum. But in the meantime, the Smithsonian Museum has already recreated Ralph's basement lab in an entire section of the Smithsonian, which is, again, a tribute to how influential this man was on what is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. And his son Mark likes to say that, well, in my family, we'd step over $20 bills to pick up nickels. So they never get rich. But he made $100 million for Sanders Associates defending patent infringements on that, for the company, not for Ralph.
I just wanted to say, I remember when you were getting ready to write this book, we went to a retirement home just outside of Manchester, over some bridge, long bridge there. And you had a forum, and it was what is New Hampshire, what does New Hampshire mean to you?
Yeah.
And you were writing things on the wall, and there were a few things you didn't have in mind, and you had circled them off.
Well, that's the beauty of getting so many more people involved. I saved myself from those errors of omission. Yes, I couldn't put in everything that people suggested, but the ones that had the greatest resonance with the greatest number of people. And it always came back to New Hampshire. Where's the New Hampshire component? You know, how can I do that? And so that was my final arbiter.
Yeah.
Like in deciding who went on our Greater Manchester Wall of Fame,
Right.
it always came back to Manchester. And here's an example, sports example. Baseball. I can't have 3 baseball players when I've got 48 people that represent 11,000 years of history. So I have Mike Flanagan, who was a baseball pitcher for the Baltimore Orioles. And Don, I'm sure you knew him as well as I
Struck
do.
out against him.
Who didn't?
Yeah.
And then I had Chris Carpenter, who each of them won the Cy Young Award, which is the award for the best pitcher in their particular league. Chris Carpenter won in the National League, Mike Flanagan in the American League. And so then you start the balancing act. Well, Mike was born in Manchester. He went to St. Francis School. He went to Memorial High School. Chris was born in Candia. He lives in Raymond. He went to Trinity High School. So you can see where's the Manchester. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, this is heavier. This has got more weight. So I did the same thing with the book. In my mind, I'd always go back and say, which is the most New Hampshire if I had to make a decision.
Yeah.
So you were there at the conception.
Yes, I was.
Well, I gave live birth, as you can see. It came out. I could go on for hours, and I'm sure you would love for me to do that. I'm joking. But I really want to thank you so much. And it's been my great privilege to have the opportunity to write about Manchester and New Hampshire, a place that I treasure beyond measure. I hope you can tell that. So this is it. What do you think about when you think about New Hampshire? 101 things. I think you guys hit about 80 right here. So now figure out what's left on the table. And there you go. Thank you so much.